Good morning. My name is Janie Montblanc. With me is our co-coordinator, Corey Gooper. And on behalf of the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange and our partners, I would like to welcome you to the final webinar in our series on seed innovations for Great Basin landscapes. Today's webinar is on current perspectives on seed technology. Mark Brunson from Utah State University will start us off with a presentation on the results of a management perspective survey, and then we'll have a panel discussion with seeding practitioners from the Nature Conservancy, Utah Department of Natural Resources, and the Bureau of Land Management. I would like to welcome our presenters. Mark Brunson is a professor in the Environment and Society Department at Utah State University. His research and teaching focuses on the dynamics of coupled human-natural systems, especially in deserts and rangelands. He is interested in the causes and consequences of human behaviors in natural environments and how those behaviors may be influenced by people's perceptions of the ecological conditions that result from human impacts. He also happens to be the director of our Great Basin Fire Science Exchange. Owen Baughman from the Nature Conservancy, Kevin Gunnell from Utah Department of Natural Resources, and Erik Kriwox, Tony Owens, and Michael McCampbell from the Bureau of Land Management will introduce themselves during the panel discussion. Thank you all and welcome for presenting and being on the panel today. And with that, you can take it away, Mark.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Janie, and thanks to everyone who is participating today and tuning in for this. And I hope you've had a chance to participate in the entire series webinar series we've been running on seeding innovations. One of the things that we talk about when we do these kinds of efforts to try and improve our seeding capacity is we focus on how we can improve either the seeds or the environment. And that's part of it. But what I and my colleagues have been trying to understand is how do these various innovations play out in the minds of the people who we would have to use them. Scientists are always really good at coming up with new things to do, and some of them may work and some of them may not. And some of them may be practical and some of them may be just academics thinking about things. And so that's what today we'll be talking about. I should mention that my doctoral student, Carmen Calzado Martinez, who is currently home in Spain and could not participate, did the lion's share of the research that I'm going to describe today. Now, as I mentioned, there's really two kinds of ways that we think about innovating to improve restoration success. One is trying to work with the environment to improve its capacity to grow things. Might be creating a more hospitable environment for seedlings. It might be targeting microsites that are already better for seeds to become established. And there's we heard from Nicole Barker earlier this week, talking about her robot approach, where they're looking for ways to be able to target the best microsites for seeding. This is something else that Nicole has worked on, and other colleagues of mine down in southeastern Utah. These are connectivity modifiers that are basically designed to trap sediment and litter and other things to create more hospitable settings for seeds. Another way we do it is by focusing not on the environment, but on the plants. And so we select or try and select plants that are most likely to succeed, or try to enhance the plants to increase survival. So as an example of that, we heard last week from Beth Ledger and Rob Masadi, who were talking about ways that we're trying to figure out how to best select the right seeds for the environments where we need to do restoration. And then later in the week, we heard from Matt Madsen, who was talking about ways to enhance plants through seed coatings that maybe allow the seeds to be protected from predation, or to be to be able to germinate at exactly the right time. So there's a number of different ways to do this, but there's really another piece of it. When you're trying to decide how to overcome these bottlenecks, it's not only an ecological choice. It's not only about the environment or about the plant. Environmental contexts certainly matter to a restoration decision maker, but when you're choosing among the approach that you're going to use for restoration or post-fire rehabilitation, you're also thinking about things like, what is feasible within my budget and staffing constraints? For example, if I've got a large amount of fire in a particular year, I may say, okay, what can I afford in terms of seed? And I may say, I can't afford the seeds that would be best. I need to get something on the ground, so I'm going to get what I can get. There's also tendencies of the agencies and organizations that we work with, where you might find that some institutions have different ways of thinking about how they go about restoration. For example, when I work with the Park Service, they're much more interested in passive restoration approaches than, say, the Bureau of Land Management might be. And that has partly to do with where they are, and partly, I think, due to just what people typically do in their organization. And then finally, there are some, at the really big scale, there can be some societal pressures. We may choose to restore, to focus on one area over another area because it's more visible. Or we may choose not to use a particular practice because there is a community group or an environmental group that's opposed to it, and we don't want to wait for the to be appealed or sued. And so all of these things all of these can constitute bottlenecks that keep from our being able to use the tool that we really think might be best. And so what I wanted to do was really focus on how do people's personal experiences of all these different kinds of constraints and bottlenecks fit together? How do people perceive different kinds of emerging practices and their effectiveness, their ease of use, and their likelihood of being able to meet their needs? And so that's what this study is about, that Carmen has been working on for her dissertation research. So we wanted to know, as I said, how do practitioners perceive emerging plant-focused innovations? And we focused on 5 different kinds of practices. So using locally adapted seeds, ones that we harvested, particularly harvested near the restoration site, using seeds that may or may not have been harvested nearby, but at least were harvested from seed zones where it's mapped that you should be able to move species with relatively little risk. Seed coating technologies, such as Matt talked about, where we're applying materials to seed surfaces to affect either the timing of germination or reduce below ground threats to the seeds, or just make sure they have more resources available to them, like with seed balls. And then there's a couple of them that really bypass the seed stage altogether. Either instead of trying to seed with sagebrush seeds, let's try planting plugs, sagebrush, or something that I've been working on with Kari Veblen and from Utah State University, and Dave Pike from now retired from the U.S. Geological Survey, looking at preemptive planting of grasses and forbs into communities that have been identified at risk. So essentially arming communities before there is a major disturbance by adding perennial grasses or forbs into places that are starting to lose them. So the first part of my research that I'm going to present today is really focusing on that piece of it in particular, because that was what USDA was paying us to learn about. But to what extent, what do people think about this idea of preemptive planting? So what Carmen first did was a series of what we call key informant interviews. So she had 12 long, in-depth conversations with federal and state agency people who were identified as working in Great Basin rangelands, who made decisions about how to address, how to improve resilience or resistance of rangeland landscapes in the Great Basin. And she used what the social scientists call a phenomenological approach. So it was really kind of a deep dive into people's experiences within this context of restoration. So they were interviews that typically lasted 30 minutes to an hour. And they were designed to to really try and dig deep into what people were thinking about when they make restoration choices. So there were some general questions about people's approaches, their philosophies about how to do this, when to do it, when to make decisions about whether to do it. And then also she also specifically asked about what people perceived as barriers to adoption and implementation of this particular practice of preemptive planting. And I'm happy to say that this part of the research was just accepted for publication yesterday in Restoration Ecology. So it won't appear online for, maybe a month or whatever. Eventually will become widely available. And when it is, I'm sure we'll work, Corey and Janie and I will work to make sure that there's links available to people. So what did we learn? Well, in terms of these non-environmental factors, non-ecological factors as potential bottlenecks, the thing that was mentioned most often is the same thing that I'm sure all of you were already thinking, which is budget and staffing. There's sort of a paradox that occurs where economies of scale tend to push you toward larger projects because a smaller project still carries some fixed costs, for example, NEPA, that you might as well get more done if you can. But then that can limit your options due to seed availability because there often isn't enough seed to be able to do everything you might want to do in a large area where you might be able to do in a smaller area. Also, some things within the agency, the federal agencies, talking about the timing of the fiscal year with relative to when seeding is supposed to occur, when planting typically occurs, rules about how you basically have to empty your budget every year. Federal agency interviews also were more likely to report that they felt bound by standard protocols. They had less flexibility. And then all across the board, they wanted definitive science. People kept saying, this is all fine, but we want to see the data first. We want to make sure, we want to see the demonstration areas first. We won't try anything because we really need to be able to have good science to back it up so we can respond to the inevitable critics. The other thing that Carmen did in this project is she used something that she identified, found something that had been used in social science, but never before in rangeland or in restoration work, which we called causal layered analysis. So what this is sort of looking at the superficial versus the more deeply seated kinds of ideas that people have that guide our decision processes. So there's 4 basic layers that they talk about. The top layer, the litany layer, is the surface. Those are the things that when you ask a question, you get immediate responses, things that people believe are true and that no one would question them about. You go a little deeper and people will start talking more about some technical explanations. They'll talk about things within their organization that are important. Keep going further and you start to hear about just general practice and philosophy. And if you really dig down and you really sort of press people, you begin to hear about some of the ways that their own moral values or their emotional responses to ecosystems might affect their ability, the kinds of choices they make. And so the social scientists who have done this call these the litany, systemic worldview and myth layers. And the myth layer is the most persistent over time, and the litany is the one that is most likely to change situationally. So what she found was the most frequently thing she heard at the litany level was lack of capacity, as you might expect, expense, time, and staff limits, and also scale mismatch. The fact that in the Great Basin, the need is so great relative to our ability to be able to do some things, in particular planting forbs or seeds or even sagebrush. Next, what came out frequently was the sort of default positions of the agencies and the offices they're in, and then the laws and regulations that guide them. Digging deeper, she found that a lot of choices were rooted in their faith in science, and also biases within the organization toward particular kinds of practices that may be built into the regulations and built into the way we've been trained. And at the bottom level, at the mythic level, was sort of this idea that nature knows best, the primacy of natural processes. And so there was a general unease about early intervention before a problem happened, because there's this if it ain't broke, don't fix it idea, rather than maybe we can keep it from breaking. So that's basically where she started. And then having those things, we use that to help guide how we did this practitioner survey. So she developed some hypotheses based on the results of the key informant interviews. And then she did an online survey of practitioners, again, choosing the 5 innovations I mentioned before. And her sample, the first thing we did is we went to anybody who is a member of the Society for Ecological Restoration and who says in their profile that they, that's available in an online directory available to members, that they work in a Western US desert. So it included the Colorado Plateau as well as the Great Basin, and that might affect some of the responses we get. And for that matter, it also included a few people who worked in the Sonoran and Mojave deserts. And then because when we started looking at that list, we realized there weren't enough people who work for the Bureau of Land Management, which has the most amount of area in the Great Basin. So we worked with BLM to add another sample of 30, we ended up with 34 responses from people who work in post-fire kinds of situations. And so we asked people about how often they use, we asked, among other things, we asked about the frequency of their current use of all 5 of these things that we were asking about, what people thought about their effectiveness and about their feasibility. So what did we learn here? Well, first, when we asked how often they use these things, they had the choice of usually, always, sometimes, or never. And the numbers, by the way, are the count. So that's the number of responses. So what we see here is that there were more people reporting that they used, either locally adapted or provisional seed zones. Nobody says I never use locally adapted seed, but the only one where they, always or usually was the default response was for provisional seed zones. When we got to the other practices using seed coatings, planting sagebrush plugs, or preemptive grass forward planting, there were people who said they sometimes try and use these things, but relatively few people said they always do. How about, she asked, how effective do you think these would be to achieve your objectives, assuming there were no cost barriers? So let's start with, a perfect world. Is this practice in principle worth doing? And leaving out the provisional seed zones for these because we see provisional seed zones as being provisional, that we're moving towards something empirical. And so we didn't include that one because we weren't sure how long it would be around. But locally adapted seed was the practice that was perceived to be most effective, most likely to be effective. It's the only one where people were most likely to say it was very effective. But it was interesting that the next one in terms of people saying either very effective or likely to be effective was the preemptive planting one. So seed coatings, people were less sure about that, and planting sagebrush plugs. And you'll also notice that there were fewer total responses for those two, partly because we had people who don't work in sagebrush region, and partly I think because they just knew less about the seed coatings. And then we said, all right, now let's get down to reality. How about your ability to use these where you work, given the objectives you have and your available resources? And now what we see is something really interesting. So the locally adapted seed goes from being the best thing to do to being hard, relatively difficult to accomplish. And in fact, the only one where some very easy was the number one response, it was actually tied with difficult, was the preemptive planting. So people were pretty sure that it was going to be hard to do seed coatings, and even there were more people who thought it would be difficult to plant sagebrush plugs. So notice that all 3 of those, difficult or very difficult, was the modal response. And so that's a little depressing, I think, but it's the reality we work in. One of the things that we wanted to do also is, well, how do federal and non-federal practitioners differ? Because, federal folks, first of all, have more landscape that they need to deal with. Typically, a state and often folks like Nature Conservancy making work on their own preserves, or Fish and Wildlife Service. Other folks may have different constraints, but also different opportunities simply because of the scale. We compared non-federal and federal respondents. And the main thing I want you to see on this graph is this is the non-federal folks, which these patterns look pretty much the way that we saw in the previous graph. But what you notice is that once you get to the federal practitioners, they're much more likely to say it's going to, they're much less likely to say it's going to be easy. So the message we have here is that nothing is easy if you work for the BLM, the Forest Service, the Park Service, or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She also wanted to know, well, do the practitioners' viewpoints differ from what we heard in the interview? So how much can we predict? Do the interviews predict what people were thinking? So she chose a question that referred to each of the 4 layers of the causal layers. So at the litany layer, at the most superficial, she said, ask, you had 2 choices. Would you rather have an intensive focus on critical areas that are most important, or an extensive, looking at and focusing on post-disturbance? Both groups focused more on post-disturbance, but there was a statistically significant difference between non-federal and federal people, with federal people much more likely to want to do extensive, they prioritize extensive needs. At the next level, at the systemic level, she asked, well, what kinds of changes to funding do you expect to see? What do you think is going to happen in your agency? And interestingly, on both sides, about 3/4 of the people said it's likely to increase, which is I think, kind of hopeful. At the worldview level, she asked, well, what's best to respond after disturbance? Should you use a passive approach, or should you use human intervention? Not surprisingly, almost everybody focused on human intervention was going to be necessary in these landscapes and dryland landscapes. Maybe not if we'd asked the same thing in another kind of wetter system. And then finally, should we, this question about should we intervene in advance? How about the if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of project? And interestingly, her hypothesis was that folks would be likely to want to react to repair damage rather than preparing proactive intervention. And yet by far, people wanted to be proactive. And so that was, for those of us who are working on this proactive technique, that was interesting for us. So finally, what are the take-home messages? Well, choosing seeds to fit the site is pretty common, and it's seen as effective, but it's also perceived as often very difficult to do. When we move to seed coding, many people aren't sure they could use it. There's still the jury's still out on that one in terms of when we can use it, how we can use it, how we would get the coatings, who's going to do that, can we contract for it? There's lots of questions that we hope will be answered fairly soon for the things that seem to be working. The proactive approach is pretty attractive, but it wasn't clear to people that this could fit with the scale of the needs that people have on federal land. So it may be most attractive for people with smaller landscapes that they can really be a little more intensive in working on. Federal practitioners tend to believe they can't achieve objectives with current resources. And yet, even with that, the responses we found showed that there was persistence, people want to keep going, and there's even some optimism. And so that's, I like to end on a happy note, and that's the happiest note I could find in that one. So with that, I want to thank folks who have contributed funding for this. We funded by the USDA, NIFA, and also the Utah Experiment Station, my research collaborators, and also not necessarily all of them named here, but the hordes of people who helped us plant all the seedlings for the ecological side of the study. And I'm ready for questions.
Great, thanks so much, Mark. Yeah, if anyone has questions about this study for Mark, please go ahead and type them in. But if there are none, we can answer them within the panel discussion as well if they come up. All right, well, with that, I will bring up some of the panel slides here. Okay, so let's begin our panel. We're going to go around and we have 5 panelists. So each panelist is going to go around and introduce themselves and answer a couple of questions. And then after that, we'll open it up to the whole floor, to the whole audience, and feel free to type any questions you have for the panel regarding their experiences with seeding and restoration, and other questions you may have. And then we'll have a discussion. And if you want to request to open your mic, we can do that too. So we're going to start with Owen Baughman from the Nature Conservancy. And go ahead, Owen.
Great. Can everybody hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, excellent. My name is Owen Baughman. I'm here representing the Nature Conservancy. I'm a scientist based in Oregon, but I also support TNC's relatively new Sagebrush Seed program, which is a program of folks from 6 different TNC chapters, working partners outside of TNC to reverse declines in sagebrush ecosystems. The biggest area of focus we have currently is on developing and refining seed technologies to improve restoration success. We're working with the USDA ARS and some other partners to not only research whether or not these seed treatments are working, but to really try to refine them and make them scalable solutions that can work at the really large scales that we need to, given how many millions of acres are or will be restoration. You can advance the slide. And our main focus over the last 5 years has been on establishing quality field tests on many different technology prototypes, making sure to test these things in lots of different locations that are pretty realistic. And if you look at the map, the blue dots are locations of our kind of core team members and close working collaborators. And then the green dots are some of the field test locations over the last 5 to 7 years. And so we're mostly conducting small plot research, but are starting to perform larger demonstrations now that we're getting more confident in our prototypes. And as you can see from the photos, we're working generally in those areas that some people call give up zones or really rough stuff. That's kind of where we've been hoping we can find some solutions.
Great, thanks. And then can you answer the question, either is there a seeding innovation that you've tried and had success with in the field, or what do you see as the biggest barrier to seeding success in the Great Basin in field settings?
Yeah, jump into, the biggest barrier that we can do something about is the lack of appropriate seeds and the lack of the right quantities. But I actually want to focus on something else that's, I think, an even bigger barrier that we have less control over. And that's just, and I think everyone here is aware of it, but the variation from year to year and site to site in the specific barriers that actually drive success or failure. There's just this inescapable complexity of which barriers are leading to failure. And that itself is a major barrier. And it creates a situation in which things that work best in each site or each year is really variable. And this complicates our ability to learn quickly or to see real lasting solutions and try to even identify those solutions, because sometimes nothing works. Sometimes anything you might have tried will work. And so we can't control this variation. It's just a natural part of this part of the world. But we can control how much we recognize it and respond to it with, institutional patience and wherewithal. It's unwise to conclusions when something works once or twice, even if you really want to, or to lose hope when something doesn't work once or twice. So we need to be able to see beyond that variation to identify tools that really consistently improve success. And this is challenging, but I'm increasingly confident that there's nothing out there that's going to work every time. The best we will ever have, I think, is a series of good tools and techniques that will each incrementally improve success and that work well when combined with other tools that incrementally improve success. So, I think success in dryland restoration is built with a lot of pieces. They're all stacked up appropriately. It's not built with any large monolithic single techniques. And so I think being able to constantly focus on that is a big barrier.
Great, thank you so much. All right, Kevin, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Kevin Gunnell. I'm with the Great Basin Research Center and Seed Warehouse in Ephraim, Utah. I'm an employee with the Division of Wildlife Resources, part of the Department of Natural Resources here in Utah. And what the Great Basin Research Center and Seed Warehouse is really a logistic and information hub for restoration work throughout the state of Utah. We kind of a jack of all trades, and as far as addressing innovations into the barriers, we look at innovations of a lot of the things that Mark was discussing in his study. The myriad of pictures I just threw on here of different activities that we take in. We acquire seed for restoration work throughout Utah, as well as mix and disperse that to projects. We develop equipment for seed placement, as well as maintain and deliver that to projects. And we also do plant material development, trying to address that barrier of plant material availability, as well as methods of increasing success in the field. We work with Dr. Mattson in a lot of his enhancement technologies, and just in trying to improve success throughout the range area. But I think, getting to some of what Dr. Brunson had talked about, I think if you want to advance the slide, one of the main innovations we have here in Utah that we found successful to work landscape scale is this watershed restoration initiative. And it's a partnership and collaboration to do landscape scale projects across borders. The BLM, the Forest Service, state, private entities are all part of this initiative. And you can look at the numbers there and see the scale that we're working at. And I think Dr. Brunson mentioned this, there is some economy of scale to this, able to do large acreages, but I'd maybe push back and say that even within those large acreages, we do have the ability to be more targeted, not maybe in the entire treatment area, but we can target within treatment areas and do more focused approaches to specific species or methods that can prioritize and increase success. So yeah, I mean, I really, this is one of the biggest innovations that has moved success in our world, and helped to drive innovation itself, providing funding, providing flexibility in how projects are done. I would say one of the main barriers that still exists is something that Owen alluded to or mentioned, is that the episodic nature of restoration, and that funding and policy doesn't necessarily match that. We have been able to address that to some degree within this, having carryover funding that will do multi-year projects, but actually addressing that episodic nature of restoration needs is still definitely a barrier there. But all said and done, just the vast scale of what we've been able to do is a success story in my mind. When Owen said this too, the millions of acres that need active restoration, we're beginning to address that through this partnership and through this proactive. And that's the other part of this, is the ratio of proactive versus just reactive work is quite high. So we have an opportunity to go in and really plan and target versus being wholly reactive when fires happen. So I'll leave it at that and take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Kevin. Let's give Erik a chance to introduce himself. Erik, then Tony and Michael.
Thanks. Yeah, my name is Erik Kriwox. I'm the fire ecologist for the Garbage Field Office on the Twin Falls District in Idaho. My job has two different components to it. On one hand, I plan and implement our fuels projects for my assigned area. So that includes fuel breaks that we've been implementing, and then also some restoration type projects using chemicals and seeding and different tools like that. And then the other part of my job is ESR, so wildfire rehabilitation type projects in my area. I don't know if I have a great answer for either of the two questions posed to us. I guess one thing I would like to say though is that, like, at least here, and I think on most districts in the BLM, our fuels work and our ESR work is critical to have a good team. We've got a really good program here with our ESR folks, which Tony is a key member of that, but we've had a lot of fire on the district, and then in the Snake River Plain, you know, obviously we have a lot of invasives with cheatgrass and Medusa head and a lot of the noxious weeds. But so a little bit of innovation that we've developed here has just been that, you know, we've been forced to either by fire or the prevalence of the invasives. So, you know, we've developed things like, you know, modified drill seeders that fit our specific areas a little better, to, you know, some forb seeding techniques, different chemical application techniques, the fuel breaks, things like that. So it's literally just an evolution here, you know, as we're faced with different challenges. But you know, just going back to, it takes a team. You know, I do a lot of the planning for my area, but the guys that are on the ground carrying this stuff out and doing the implementation, the knowledge and experience there is just really critical to our success here. So that'll have Tony.
Thank you.
So my name's Tony Owens. I'm the weeds and ESR specialist for the Twin Falls district here in Idaho. My major role is I am the implementation. So once we have a plan together, one of my main roles is how do we do it and how do we do it in the time allowed. I'll just jump right into the barrier and then I'll go in. But one of our main barriers for us is our late season fires and even early season fires. By the time we can start these seedings, our rule of thumb here in the Twin Falls district is we're typically getting started on these projects end of August, but our rule of thumb is we have to be out of the desert by Thanksgiving. And so for me, I'm in charge of purchasing the seed through the consolidated seed buy with the BLM, to receiving the seed, testing the seed, mixing the seed, and then the logistics of getting it to our own people or to the contractors. And I just think one of our biggest barriers is that short time window where everything has to be perfect in order to get it done, and you know, and the weather. So that's pretty much all I got.
Thank you. All right, Michael.
Thanks for having me today. Good day to you folks. My name is Michael McCampbell, and I'm a natural resources specialist with the Winnemucca District Bureau of Land Management. I currently serve as the noxious weeds coordinator here in the district, and I've been involved in a lot of seeding treatments as part of ESR, emergency stabilization rehabilitation, hazardous fuels programs, mining reclamation, and general habitat and rangeland improvement projects since 2014. Here at the Winnemucca District, we're grateful for the rangeland for the research in seeding innovations that's taken place, both here on the district that some of the other panelists have worked in, and also around the Great Basin, and glad that we can apply that to the work we do here in Northwest Nevada. On the Winnemucca District, we seed tens of thousands of acres each year in an attempt to restore or rehabilitate degraded rangelands and protect healthy, intact ecosystems. We use helicopters, fixed-winged aircraft, tractors pulling rangeland drills, vehicle-mounted broadcast seeders, harrows, and hand-powered belly grinders to get the seed where we want it. And we purchase tons of seed each year, whatever's commercially available and closest to matching our site requirements. We also have contracted grow-outs to produce local collections and have collected our own seed in-house and commissioned seed collections to try to get that best seed that we can. A lot of our seeding treatments are done in conjunction with other treatments, like mowing fuel breaks, pre-emergent herbicide to reduce competition of invasive annual grasses, intensive noxious weeds treatments, seedling, hand planting, soil stabilization, control structures, and changes in grazing management. We've had some great successes and some pretty large-scale failures. We have some level of monitoring on most of our seeding projects, but not usually to the level that we can, identify that key success or fatal flaw of that particular seeding. Weather, drought, seed coming from different climates are popular culprits to blame our failures on. But as Owen and others mentioned already, it's hard to tell what the major problem is, and pretty hard to fix that when you don't know what it is. So a success on the low tech end of seeding innovations that I'll highlight today is a way that we've been able to get our hands on some locally sourced seed to fill a gap in what's commercially available. With the Winnemucca district being at the drier end of the Great Basin precipitation, most of the seed that's commercially available was sourced from higher precipitation zones, even though it's the same species that we're planting here. And one of the species that we use the most in our seed mix is sandberg bluegrass, Poa secunda, or posy for you plant monitoring nerds out there. In 2016, we had a Seeds of Success intern that scouted out the harshest and most degraded sites on the district where sandberg bluegrass was able to outcompete cheatgrass. And using collections by this intern, we were able to have our seed increased in an agricultural setting. And two of those source collections performed very poorly in agricultural setting, but one did excellent, and it was able to produce restoration level quantities. And also in innovation in acquiring those local seeds, we've contracted crews to collect sagebrush seed right next to burned areas that we then used in producing seedlings for planting in those burned areas, as well as direct seeding. And while we know that vegetation already growing at the site has the genes necessary to survive there, the development and implementation of seed transfer zones, I believe, is helping and will continue to help us identify the best source selections of seeds that are commercially available. And I'm looking forward to the days when we can apply some of these other seed modification and seeding technologies at the landscape level. So honored to be on the panel today. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say about the discussions and questions that y'all have.
Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to start with our only question that was in advance, and that was thoughts on seed collection regulation. What are your thoughts on seed collection regulation? Would you like to see more certification, or does that create barriers to availability? Who wants to take that one?
Well, I have just a little bit of experience with that, so I guess I'll answer it, and then maybe somebody that, if there's more experience, can elaborate. But in my limited experience, we did have what I mentioned earlier, that sandberg bluegrass collection source certified by the state of Nevada, and I wasn't fully running that project from our side of things, but from what I saw of it, it didn't seem like a real big barrier. It was kind of took us a while from getting started to getting completed, but I wouldn't see it as, from my experience, as a huge barrier. And if it wasn't something that I knew myself exactly where it had come from, I would put a pretty high value on having that certification, knowing what the actual source of my seeds was. So I believe valuable and not overly burdensome, but maybe somebody else has more horror stories.
I can speak to that, Jeannie, a little bit. I mean, we deal with certification a lot, and I would agree. I don't think it's overly onerous to have certification processes. The source ID program out of Utah, I'm not sure if other states have picked that up, is valuable in knowing provenance of the seed that the wild and collected seed, particularly, that we're purchasing. We also have, the larger headache is actually both the BLM and ourselves. We have our own independent testing for quality that's done, which takes time to perform. The certification is usually done ahead of time. It's usually not a major barrier. I would suggest that, you know, those independent testing and sampling takes longer and is sometimes more of a headache of getting over, but that's internal issues. The other issue within, I would say, and I may get myself in a little hot water, but it's not degrading anybody. I would say the variance among tests that you receive among labs is an issue that it maybe isn't talked about as often as maybe should be. It's not to denigrate any lab. They're all professional, but there is definitely variance when among labs and even within labs as you get those tests back. And so having a confidence, a tool that you're very confident in quality standards and things that are going into those certifications is, especially in our lower purity species, I mean, there's a broad swath of variation in species that labs may not be used to looking at. And so addressing some of those uncertainties would be a good thing to do.
Great, thanks so much. All right, with that, I'll go to the questions in the chat. The first one is, any preliminary insights into what works? That's a biggie.
I think everybody's had their thing that works, and yeah, you feel like a genius when you get something that works a little bit, but you try it again and it usually doesn't. So that's me skating around that a little bit. But I don't know. I think of a medical analogy when I think of this. It's like we need to treat, you know, sites like patients. You know, there's no panacea drug out there in medicine. And when those things do come up in medicine, people make a bunch of money, but nobody really gets help because nothing really can solve everybody's ails. So I think it's similar. These sites need to be, what works is understanding the site, you know, plundering all the knowledge you have on your team or other people who've worked in that area and adding up the things that have worked into a bit of a house of cards. And that seems to work, but I will default to other folks doing larger scales.
Anybody else have secrets that they can share on what works?
I think Owen hit on it a lot. Not just site, but species that you're working at and understanding requirements that are there, and using the best tools that we may be limited in tools, but we do have tools, and you can cater those tools to both the site and to the species that you're trying to establish on those sites. And just making due diligence, not having a standard prescriptive treatment is necessary. You've got to take it a project by project basis is really what it comes down to. No silver bullets, sorry, other than rain. Rain's the one silver bullet.
Yes. All right, thank you so much. Next question, are there any plans to put in small plots in central or southern Nevada and Utah?
That might have come up during my introduction. We do have some northern central Nevada and kind of northern Utah. It's we're kind of limited by just driving around. It takes a long time to hit all these sites. So I do have interest in, you know, testing all the things that we test with the Nature Conservancy and the ARS in pretty realistic sites. And so you know, we try to get as far flung as we can, but central and southern, you know, starting to get into different zones that, you know, edge of the sagebrush, starting to get into Mojave things. And I think there's other folks than me working in some of those areas doing lots of research on some of this. But yeah, I think we're about to scale up and hopefully work with BLM and other folks to put in demos in a real large range just to identify where these things work and where they don't, because even the best thing we come up with is going to have limitations, and we're going to say like, yeah, it doesn't work over there, but it works best here, you know. So finding that for our tools and for any other tool is really important, because the Great Basin is a bummer in that it seems like it's a big thing that's like, oh, it's the Great Basin, yeah, but any chunk of it is different from any other chunk, and so it's not really one thing. It's this smeared.
Oh, you're cutting out on us. Okay, well, we might get going back.
I'll pick up a little bit on that question too. Aside from Owen's work, BYU's work in a lot of their enhancement technologies, they are working here, and we've worked a little bit with TNC in spreading, testing some of their enhancements here as well. But yeah, and we're looking at, actually, one of the questions was, when are these things going to be available? And we're actively working with BYU and looking to take things to scale, just like Owen's talking about, and looking to take some of the enhancement technologies across the Great Basin into the Colorado Plateau to really show project scale, whether they work or not. So we're going to hopefully start that within this year. It may be a year away, but we're hopefully soon. So if people are interested, let us know. We can maybe coordinate something together.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought that up, Kevin. That was the other question in advance we got, is when will new technologies be available? So I appreciate you speaking to that. Okay, within the agencies, BLM specifically, are you encouraged to work with researchers or other scientists on projects that are experimental? I guess, do you like it or not like it?
Well, in terms of encouragement here in the Winnemucca district, there's a little bit of that comes from several different sources. So we do have encouragement to work with studies, and we've been doing that. A lot of those come across my desk as the proposals come in from different organizations that want to do research, and I like those. I especially like that we can get the data from here locally, so it's most applicable to us for us to use that in the future. There are some hangups that occasionally come along with that, with getting something may have to go through NEPA, getting clearance for things. Maybe trying to test out, had one where they wanted to test a new herbicide and then seeding after that. And sometimes those can be so cumbersome that by the time we get through it, the research has been collected elsewhere. So there's some setbacks in that area, but definitely are encouraged for working with these experiments.
That's great, thanks.
Could I talk about that from the researcher side too?
Yes, please.
And in the number of projects I've been involved with over the last 25 years or whatever, I have rarely found a BLM, Forest Service, or other agency that was totally unwilling to work with us. People, we come with an idea, and a lot of it has to do with the researcher understanding a little bit about what the agency has to do and vice versa. But I feel pretty good about people's willingness to engage in especially smaller scale projects. One thing I have noticed is that if you are a researcher, it would be really useful to find the funds to pay for the archaeological clearances yourself and put it into the project, rather than sort of assuming that somehow the BLM is going to just do that because it's part of their job, because that can be a significant hurdle for folks. And sometimes, I can think of one project on Elko where the agent's office was happy to work with us, but then there was an environmental organization that decided they didn't like what our research project was about, and so they sued. And we took us another couple of years to get the project into the ground, at which point it was less helpful. But that's a little different. But my experience with the Bureau of Land Management And certainly with the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources and Utah DNR has been really positive. And of course, TNC has their own researchers, so they really understand research.
That's good to hear that the communities enjoy working with each other and that gets done. Thanks. Okay, let's see, next question. Our seed-based restoration is usually done post-herbicide treatment. I don't know if I'm gonna say this right, aminopyralid, which has a pre-emergent on areas previously occupied by noxious weeds. We're limited to broadcast seeding due to terrain. Our success is very limited. Is there any research on seeding post pre-emergent herbicide applications such as aminopyralid? I'm wondering if seed-based restoration and pre-emergent herbicides are compatible. Who wants to take that?
So I'll take a stab at it. And I may not be completely understanding the question, but I think what they're asking is, are herbicides such as aminopyralid or other pre-emergent chemicals appropriate to use post-seeding? So here in Twin Falls, we have a policy where we don't put chemical on burned ground without any kind of vegetation on it. So we put chemical treatments for invasives in all of our ESR plans, but typically they're 1 to 3 or even further years out post seeding, post restoration. And that's primarily just because we don't want to have that chemical drift and blow. We have a lot of wind here. We have a lot of soil movement post wildfire, and so we use those pre-emergent type chemicals all the time post seeding. Again, it's a timing thing, you know, whether it's you know, in the fall before we have you know, before the cheatgrass greens up again, or even in the springtime. Spring aerial herbicide treatments are pretty tough here again because of the wind, but we do a lot of those types of treatments in the fall, September, October timeframe.
I'll maybe address a little bit of the herbicide in conjunction with seeding. I think that might be a little bit of the question too. Not specifically aminopyralid, but it's obviously going to be herbicide specific. Most of the work on pre-emergence is done with plateau and mazopic, and it's been shown that it will inhibit seeding if done, you know, same year, that it will have negative effects on seeding. And so some of the prescription with mazopic in general is spray the year before you seed in order to let the herbicide deplete. And you get better success, but there's trade-offs to doing that. So, but the big herbicide coming out right now is indaziflam for cheatgrass control, and the prescriptive recommendations with that is not to seed in conjunction with that, to establish seeding prior to the use of that, because its residual is several years and will have likely impact your seeding. So it really is herbicide specific, and yeah, getting creative, and because you've got to control competition still, you know, getting creative in your prescriptions there. But.
Great, thank you.
I can add one more thing here. One of the biggest focus that we've had with our group for seed technologies is this herbicide protection seed technology, where we're trying to create things we can add to the seeds, coatings or pellets that allow the seeds to be seeded and sprayed immediately afterwards, and it would protect the seed you want from the herbicide while allowing that herbicide to still get and impact all the weeds you want. And that's been a big focus, I think, because whoever asked that question knows the challenge. It's like, I need to get rid of weeds, but I also need to get natives in there, and the weeds usually come back even after a successful treatment. And so that's why we think that this herbicide protection technology is could be a really transformative tool. And so we've seen it work. We know that it works. We use activated carbon to absorb herbicide. We've mostly worked with the Mazapic. We're going to start working with indaziflam a bit more. I haven't worked with the one they mentioned, but we're really trying to make sure these things can be used at a large scale. So even though we've got some that sort of work, we're trying to make them small and easier so that they can broadcast seeders. And so I know that people out there have heard about stuff for a decade at this point, and it's like, where is it? Why can't we use it? We're working on it. We're working to try to make sure that these things don't just look good and not work, or they just can't be used at scale. And so that's why it's taken a while, but we are getting pretty close. And but yeah, I think it's a real, it's not going to be a silver bullet, but it's going to be something that can be used in those areas, hopefully, to allow for native plants to establish during that period of weed control.
Great, thank you. Someone commented, I have seen methods where they seed and cover with a layer of charcoal to protect the seed, then spray pre-emergent. We just have one more question. I know we're a little bit over by a minute, but if folks are willing to stay on just a couple minutes more to answer the last question, that'd be wonderful. Are folks happiest with just sticking with grasses only, forb and grasses and mixes, plus sage seed? I know much depends on the site, soils, etc. Do any of you have a selection of best matrix species, widespread distribution, tough and tenacious?
Well, we do we use all of these types of seed mixes in various projects. I don't necessarily know that which one I'm happiest with. It kind of depends on the site and what's available. A lot of times we like to include sagebrush, but the seed isn't ready to be purchased when we're trying to put it on the ground. So that sometimes adds a compounding factor to adding that one in there, just because of the season that the seed becomes ripe and is collected. We don't really have a particular matrix of seeds for widespread distribution, but I guess the ones that keep on continually coming back into our seed mixes are those Sandberg bluegrass that goes out a lot of places, blue bunch wheatgrass. Those are our two main workhorses that go in a lot of our mixes, just because they have such a wide range on our district and have had some pretty good success in the past. But then working in other grasses, forbs, and shrubs along with those, site dependent.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add there that it's not impossible to give like a generalized matrix of species just because of the variation. And I'm a proponent too of, as it's been alluded to, site by site, project by project needs. And honestly, there's likely a lot of projects that we put seed on that we don't need to seed. And knowing that and letting the natural genetics of the location perform and do that work is something that we should always be considering as well. Do we actually need to put seed down? If we do, what species and how much of it? We're just trying to re-engage that natural successional, put these systems back into function. We aren't trying. I think it's not necessarily a good idea to cater species specific or anything that way. We're trying to make stable systems is what we're striving for, functioning stable systems.
Great, thank you. Good point.
I'll just add a little bit to that. I agree completely with both Kevin and Michael. One thing that I will typically do is, after determining if a site really does need the seeding, but I really look at rangeland health and the functional structural groups, and I try to pick species that will work in those areas, but that will fill those individual niches. So, a deep-rooted perennial grass, a shallow or medium-rooted perennial grass, forbs based on, wildlife needs, whether it's a sage grouse key area, pollinator type species. And then we typically do sagebrush aerial seeding in almost all of our ESR and fuels restoration projects. We also do a lot of the plug seedling planting, but really here we've seen really good success with the aerial seeding of sagebrush. So I typically do include either a native or a native-like cultivar, deep-rooted perennial forbs, and some kind of a shrub species in most all of my seedings.
Great, thank you. All right, well, thank you so much. Thank you, Mark, for your presentation, and thank you, panel, for sharing all your wonderful expertise. We really appreciate it.
Shady, can I make one comment?
Yes.
So this goes back to something Kevin said about WRI, Watershed Restoration Initiative. I really like the idea of calling that an innovation. It's been around for almost 20 years now, about 20 years. And so in some form, and so you would hope that other people would adopt it. But, you know, my experience has been exactly what Kevin has said about it, you know, that it has been enormously valuable. You know, our survey covered, you know, 10 parts of 11 states. And so you would have heard from people who don't have that opportunity, but it really is a superb working partner for anybody in Utah. And I don't want to suggest that it's, you know, that what we found was specific to a particular state.
Okay, thanks. Yes, I did like that. It's a good innovation too. It's a good model. All right, thank you. When I close the webinar, there will be a 3-question survey. So we'd greatly appreciate it if you would take that survey. The recording of this webinar will be posted on our Great Basin Fire Science YouTube channel within the next few days, and the link will be automatically sent to you through a Zoom webinar follow-up email. All of the webinar videos will also be posted on our Great Basin Fire Science Exchange website, and you can find them there as well. If you have further questions regarding today's or other webinars, please email or call me anytime. Thank you all for attending this webinar and the great questions, and thank you to our presenter and all our panelists. Really appreciate it. Have a great day, everybody.